Hello, everybody. So I will introduce Paul in a moment, but first some housekeeping. So the main thing that I do, which is help run the Circling Institute and teach courses in circling. The main thing I do, the Art of Circling, which is our year-long training, starts in March. So if you've been looking at it and you haven't contacted us yet, please do that soon. In all the just go to our website. There's a link for Art of Circling down there. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one for coaching or consulting, please email me, and my email is down there as well. Okay, so Paul, this was just such a rich conversation. I really had a lot of Paul's just great. He's a pastor, and his open-mindedness is incredibly amazing, and his heart is so deep. And I think as you listen to this video, you at least what was revealed to me in the video was just how deep his heart goes and how he lives his life, and the wisdom. I really felt the wisdom of it kept coming into appearance for me and impacting me. So I left this conversation just so moved and opened, and my mind was open, my heart was opened. I felt deeply close with him. And I would say nourishing in the sense that I feel really in touch humbly with life, but in a way that I feel inspired to engage with it even deeper. God, what more could you want, right? I think it's a little under a 2-hour conversation. There's lots of different moments in it. Right at the end, the last, I'd say 30 minutes, I may even edit it and just put out the last 30 minutes, because it's a moment of really of exquisiteness, exquisite depth that I experienced. So just so you know, there's lots of different phases through it, and I hope you enjoy all of it. All right. Thank you so much. Bye.
Well, how have you been?
I've been really, really, God, how have I been? Well, I guess I've been pretty good, because I don't exactly have an immediate answer to that question. So, I've been through, personally, it's been a combination of some really awesome things going on and some tragic things going on, like a bunch of deaths that hit pretty close to, more than really close to home. That especially for my wife and for me as well. While we just bought a house in Alameda, and which is really awesome. I feel like it's a really sweet spot. It feels really right. My relationship with my wife is just keeps being something I've never had before, that I keep being absolutely struck by. There's something to this marriage thing.
There is.
being growing up, in this kind of secular humanism, I kind of think where I come from is a very, I just implicitly question any social norms and any structures. It's just been part of my upbringing. I don't even know if it's been part of my upbringing. It feels like it's part of the ethos, or in the air, to just be suspicious of any of that. And as I get older, and especially through marriage, I'm starting to really realize, in kind of a profound personal way, the wisdom of it, in a way that you can't. And what I'm realizing is you can't. It's one of those kind of like an existential truth. You can know about an existential truth, you can even talk about it, but until you actually get it and experience it, that is the truth, is the experience of it, right? And I think I'm really feeling that in a deep way. My wife and I both, right? In a very, very deep way that is changing me. Yeah. It's having me really, the, all of the structures that go into the background like occur to me a lot more. And I'm like, whoa, how many thousands of lives and cultures who have, like, just to make that building, just to, like, all of that, like, so
Yeah.
much wisdom. And it's been really cool to find myself being someone that notices that and appreciates it.
So what about so I, my parents, my grandparents, my parents stayed together until my father died. My grandparents, there's very little divorce in the family. Part of that because both families, very religious,
Mhm.
strong communal bonds, reinforcing marriage.
Right.
It didn't mean that divorce was non-existent. It was just unusual. It usually only happened if there was an exceptional situation.
Mhm.
So what about marriage do you notice? Um, I mean, part of the crazy thing about working on a lot of this stuff is you just begin to realize how much there is built into things that we don't even think about.
Oh
So
yeah. Yeah.
so what aspect of the marriage are you recognizing?
Hmm.
Is it I mean, because
Well,
part of marriage is the stuckness of it,
mhm.
and it's
Yeah.
something larger. it, it's
Mhm.
it's it's resistance to the will,
Yeah.
because I've been married, how many years I've been married now? 31. It'll be 32 years this year.
Yeah.
And there are there are it is not uncommon for many married people to, at some point in the marriage, often many points in the marriage, sometimes years of the marriage, want to get out.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I remember when I was, before I was married, a pastor that was sort of a mentor of mine recommended a book on marriage that basically said, um, there's two rules: don't leave and learn to forgive. And obviously they're connected. But
Totally. Well, I would say that's one of the things that was really clear to me is because I've been with Brianne, my wife, for the better part of going on 10 years. And we actually got married um, a, about less than a year and a half ago. And so there was a period where, like, we had broken up for about a year, a little under a year and a half, and then we got back together. And that was really a big, and I think about the first 4.5 years, and then when we got back together, they're very, very different worlds. And what's interesting is I think everybody that knows us could see that we've always really, like, had a lot of ecstatic love for each other.
mm-hmm.
Like, we really like each other. Like, and there's this kind of there's always been that. But what's interesting is I think what I thought is that it's that ecstatic kind of love and liking of each other that was the key to having a relationship and making a relationship work. And what's interesting is we had that, and that's not that they had almost had nothing to, it's not that it didn't have anything to do with it. It didn't provide a relationship, right? And we still have that, but having it in this kind of container, right, that has a history and, like, has been really, we're flourishing at a new level. And what's interesting for me, I think this is partly has to do with just being a guy, right? Is because I also think some of it has to do, this is my first experience of what I think in psychology they call secure attachment. I just never had it,
Mm-hmm.
like we talked a little bit about my background before. My, like, both my parents are awesome, but like addiction and all the instability and all that. So I didn't even know how to experience that. Now there's something about marriage that does wed at a level that I think is very linked to what they call secure attachment. I don't think they're identical, but I think they're really close. And what's interesting for me is there's the experience of being with Brienne in our marriage, but then there's my relationship to the world and how it's really changed. Like the world shows up for me different. And because there's something, I put it like this. It's like, well, if I look at my life as like a mandala, right? It's kind of like, I think what I always thought was supposed to be at the center of the mandala was something like freedom, right? But I didn't realize that what ended up being at the center of the mandala was not freedom, but the obsession with preserving it on some level. And I think the sacrifice is felt like is like really actually giving up this guarding of my individual freedom on some level, right? And a lot of that had to do personally with like some deep distrust and betrayals that I had experienced, right? That I didn't even know was affecting my view of that and how I related to that. But when at some point there was an experience, and a lot of this had to do with how Brienne really shifted in her relationship with me, where I was able to unfreeze and go, oh, there's this one place. This is the one place in the universe where I relate to it differently than anywhere else, right? Like, oh, something hurts. Everything stops, and that completely matters, and we have a bond, and everything, that comes first. And I just never experienced that. But when I started to experience that, it was like in a different universe. And what it did is it felt like it took the right thing and it clunked in the center of the mandala. And then it was like an ontological chiropractic shift that it went out from the center. And I was like, oh, whoa, this is that marriage thing. There's something to that, right? And it's had me think a lot about like the conversations like that we had and that we've been having of like the larger picture of this. Because on one level, there's like Guy and his particular psychology playing out. But at another level, there's like what he's inside of, right? And what his inside of is inside of. That also contributed to this being possible. And I look at how marriages, is it 50% divorce rate, and something huge is shifting. It's definitely already shifted. And it's had me think a lot about all that stuff, just through my experience too,
It's, there's a lot, not only among Christians, among people who are exploring other faiths and other practices. There's a lot of talk about, becoming less egoic, moving off the ego.
Yeah.
I mean, marriage, some of these traditional institutions, marriage, parenthood, I mean, these are radical, brutal practices of what in Christian theological terms we would call mortification.
Yeah.
And it's people when they're in an aspirational mode say, oh, I just want to be less egoic. Oh, okay. Well, why don't you try wedding your life to another broken, selfish human being and talk to me in a few years. Let's see how that goes.
Yeah, totally.
Because I love the way you just put it together there, because you begin to realize that, yeah, I am way, way more selfish, way more self-righteous. when it comes right down to it, I'm finally all about me, and more than anything else.
Right.
And and understandably so in the kind of world that we're in.
Yeah.
But to then say, okay, I'm going to lay that down for the welfare of another. Well, what will that mean? Will I be hurt? Yes. Will I be taken advantage of? Probably more than once.
Mm-hmm.
Um, will will it be fair? Probably not, especially in my own eyes.
Yeah.
Um,
Huh.
and so that sort of laying down one's life
Yeah.
for the sake of another who may or may not be worthy of your life.
Yeah.
Well, this is a radical practice that has been participated within,
Yeah.
millions and millions of times over.
Yeah.
Bringing joy, bringing sadness, bringing loss,
Yeah.
and part of, I'm convinced that a good bit of the meaning crisis has everything to do with our affluence and
Mm-hmm.
our achievements of building a society in which the willful volition is king. And I've had many conversations with people who, they went to school, they got a job, they did all of this, and it wasn't until that child came into the world that, oh, I, the love of another
Yeah.
binds me.
Yeah.
And at in ways that, on one hand, in some moments I desperately wish to be free of, but at the same time never dare to loosen.
Yeah.
And that's something that marriage will teach you.
Totally. I'm appreciating a couple of things. I'm appreciating you describing what occurs to me is the wisdom, right? Like I hear the wisdom of not only your knowledge of it, but your knowledge of it, right? Like I hear I can hear the understanding of the trials, right? And then the commitment through, and there's recognition about it being transcendent, and in some way I'm subordinate in a way that even if I doesn't feel like a choice, I would still choose it.
Yeah.
Right? That kind of deep commitment, and the humbleness around it. I think that's what I'm appreciating. Like there's just something bigger than us around it. And I feel actually, now that I'm talking about it, I'm like, that's actually the feeling I'm having. I feel very like experientially humbled by this process, by this thing. And I think on some level it's kind of cool because it's a little bit like somebody. I ran into somebody today that had this kind of enlightening experience, right? And how he got there was he died and was resuscitated, and he experienced this whole experience of being an infant coming into maturity, gaining language, like as he came back. However, he went through it with an adult ability to understand it, right? And that's kind of like what opened him up. And in some ways, this is what I kind of feel about this. It's like, oh wow, I think at one point this happened just to be a lot more embedded in the background practices that you just did, and it was experienced but not explicitly, in a process of development that was implicit within the cultural structures. And I kind of feel like, oh, whoa, I'm like, I get to be, watch my own development from a fetus, right, through something, but with the cognitive capacity to track it and to somewhat understand what and be conscious of it at the same time. I think that's what you're hearing is like my inspiration of like what I'm learning about a little bit about reality, right? Through my experience of this. It's really exciting.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And talk about self-transcendence
Yeah.
to, have, because when we all passed through those stages,
Yeah.
we couldn't self-transcend. And I have a memory of myself. I was still, so for a while my bedroom was the same room as my father's study. And then we fixed up a room up in the attic, and then I moved up there. But I was still in my father's study, and I remember a moment of seeming seeming self-transcendence when I saw myself at that moment through different eyes, and
Mm.
had a
Mm.
sense of my own agency. And for obviously being raised in a deeply Christian home, you know God is obviously, how to talk about that word.
Mm.
God is always present, but I've been just doing so much thinking about
Mm.
this word God, and
Yeah.
what we mean by it, and how it is used in our language. I mean, similar to marriage, in that when I was at a meetup once, and I asked the group at the meetup, I said, why don't we give our marriages names? And they wondered about that. And I
Mm.
said, no, if you stop for a moment and consider your marriage, if you gave it a name and at least a degree of personification,
Yeah.
well, what would you name it?
Yeah.
And how would you relate to it? Because in a marriage, you very much have
Yeah.
yourself, your partner,
Yeah.
and the marriage becomes a third valued entity right there. And so you don't just do things for your partner, you
Yeah.
do things for the marriage.
Yes.
And so it becomes this,
Huh.
it really becomes this thing
You're right. You're
as
right.
such. But it's not it's not a thing like the
Right.
cell phone stand or my jacket I'm taking off. What
Yeah.
kind of a thing is it? If
Yes.
it's, or is it closer to, I know you're super into Heidegger. Is it closer to being? Because the marriage that you and your wife have is,
Yeah.
language is so hard with this stuff.
Totally. It's definitely a presence.
Yes.
Like in fact, we went to. This is what happens a lot these days. Is we'll go through something. Like something will happen, and then we'll interact around it, and then afterwards we'll be like, wait a minute, that used to just threaten the whole farm. like, and it's not like when we look at each other, it's not like individually I'm somehow more mature. Like it doesn't fit, and she's more mature. But we've even used this language of like, yeah, it seems like almost our marriage is more mature than both of us, right? And that there is a sense of an awareness of that there's something that there's something that we're tending to that's more important than the argument that we would have or the something like that. And it really has, I'm watching it organize our life, in a way that I think that's really true. It does feel like it feels like yeah, you're right. It does have a presence to it. That has it has, in some ways it has like, I think a little bit of like, a top down, but it also has an inspirational quality to it, right? There's like yeah, you're right. It's like there's a kind of feminine aspect to it, and there's a masculine aspect to it. It very much has taken over my conscience, right? Like, yeah, very much so. Very much so.
It's the world is a strange place,
Yeah.
and it's, and then I'd be curious to know, because I, again, being, raised in a deeply Christian place,
Yeah.
my my wife was a Christian, so
Mm-hmm.
we didn't live together until we married.
Mm-hmm.
All of that usual stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't have the experience. I mean, I have the experience of having a relationship with the woman who would become my wife before we were married,
Right.
but I I I don't have the sort of, you know, you know,
Uh-huh.
living together, sharing a bed, all of that
Oh, that's pretty.
without the marriage and then with the marriage. So I'd be curious to know what you've learned in that process.
Well, here's the thing is if I were to look at it, right? So in many ways, I've been fumble fucking my way into this, right? I've been, in some ways, I tripped into it. Like, and we happened to stumble in it and we found it, right? But if I had a choice between doing that and having it be, having it be part of the implicit sense of things, honestly, I would choose the other,
You
right?
choose which
The one that you more experienced,
oh, okay.
right? Of like where it's just kind of built into things and your individuality is shaped inside of that. Like that seems because most of the time people don't like what a thing that I'm noticing is that people don't actually trip into it. They trip over a cliff oftentimes, right? Literally. And it has me really think about like this it really is hard to comprehend the huge change with birth control, right?
Yeah.
Because I do encounter a lot of in my work like a lot of women especially, right, who are experiencing so like men that just will not like won't commit or don't want to commit, and their anxiety in the face of that and the way that they're anxious like makes the guy go away. there's nothing there's nothing actually kind of like gravitationally um taking hold that makes something like a marriage on a rational level make any sense, right? Because just like what you talked about, like and I don't know the answer to it. I feel I don't know if it's marriage. I don't know if it's I'm not sure, but I'm more impressed by to the limited degree I can see things from my own perspective of just really recently the whole game has changed, but in such a way that it's not apparent how strange it is and how different it is. That's the thing that's sealed in the matter, right? Like just in my lifetime, just in my lifetime, I look at this. It's like um, that I grew up before the before the Generation X, right? So I think I'm the last generation that has a memory before the internet, um, and that's gotten more and more meaningful, right? As
Yeah.
time goes on, I'm like realizing what a drastic, huge thing that is on every like on levels that are so far beyond my comprehension, but I can just sense it, um, is I remember when I grew up, there was a implicit sense that like you'll live your life and you will out in the process of living your life will meet somebody, right? And you'll meet somebody and you'll get married, and because on some level you look around and that's the story of most every other person, right? And like that was this that's basically what would happen, right? Except it's more conservative areas that I'm sure and like more liberal areas, but like for the most part that was it. Two, where literally what the story is now is you go on a dating site and you go basically on interviews, and that there's a sense of like who are you compatible with, right? And you match that up, um and it's this very interesting like to me that is completely it's not only a different process, but it's a different understanding about what a self is and what an other is and what a relationship. It's an ontological, epistemological transformation that is so weird and happened so quick. Like within a few years, it just went that direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think one of the things I'm finding out with this is that what dating sites in the context that arises from doesn't take into account is it's not like there's me who has a set of characteristics, and then there's you that has a set of characteristics that then are either compatible or not. It doesn't take account that, like, if we engage into a relationship, to the degree myself will be constituted and by that relationship, right? That's the part that, like, seems to be not seen or accounted for or related with in many ways. However, like, people's nervous systems still need it. You haven't told their nervous system, you haven't told their attachment system, you haven't told their, like, we're still the biological, organism with all the layers of consciousness and finitude and all of that we've always been. However, the frame that we have for making sense of it seems to be so much more flattened. And dare I say, we just kind of more and more, I think, have our sense of everything that is more of a technological understanding, where we look at the world and we don't see a future, we see a thing to optimize. Right? We don't see a potential or a telos or something to aspire. It's more like there's something here and let's extract out as much as we can from it. Right. And when you look at dating sites, and my understanding of how that's all, like, relationships are starting to be viewed as that way as well.
Yes.
So it's so weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I
look at it, it's weird.
Yeah. Well, it's, people are against the objectification of people. Well,
yeah,
that's exactly what a dating site is for.
Yeah.
You objectify people, and you also, in a sense, you tear them from. So, I put a video today on, so my wife and I and my daughter, who's living with us right now, we kind of ran through The Good Place, because you can stream it all. And so just a matter of weeks went through the whole thing. The individualism, before 300 years ago, marriage was the domain of families trying to afford their children, not necessarily happiness, but survivability, with, because marriages were about, not so much about emotional attachment, but much more about contractual arrangements, business, so on and so forth. And then, of course, progeny and continuing the family throughout history.
Yeah.
That of course radically changed, and there are a number of good books out there that talk about that shift. And so then we sort of went into this posture of, well, hopefully by the time a person is 16 or 18 or 20, they will have been formed sufficiently by the family that the formation will do its own thing and be expressed in the choice of the person, and off you go. And so, for example, in my tradition, you go, let's say, to the Christian college that your parents go to, and you'll probably find someone else who has had an upbringing similar to your own. You have enough commonality that you'll get a good match, and many things will be sustained and carried through by this process.
Yes.
Okay, now we do it on the internet. Based on a low resolution image and something like a Facebook profile, and talk about relevance, realization, and a salience hierarchy. And so, it was very interesting, because after I started making videos about Jordan Peterson, started the meetup, who came to the meetup, mostly young single men, usually, because they didn't really get into this until they started getting into their 20s. So usually between 25 and 40, we've got some who are a little bit older. And this issue came to the fore very quickly. And that was interesting.
Oh, interesting.
And a lot of that, I think, had to do because Jordan was setting out a message, an aspirational message pointing to something that people were attracted to.
Yeah.
And that attraction was in a sense, a romantic, heroic journey from the male side, that you should lay down your life for a woman and a family, that, you should lay down your future in a commitment.
Yeah.
And it's going to be costly.
Yeah.
But that is a heroic thing that you can aspire towards.
Right. Right.
And that, I think that's built within a context that says, that obviously has values all over the place, that says you as an individual defined by your skin are not the be all and end all of what this thing that you are is for. You are for something else. You are for someone else. You are for another whole community. And there is no more noble, greater thing than you can do than to sacrifice yourself for that other thing. It's a future, it's a community, it's, you don't necessarily put your finger on it, but you can sort of sense it pulling you into the future.
Yes.
And that, of course, is in competition with all of the urges and desires and appetites we have, that our commercial society has found profitable to indulge and amplify in our midst. So it's Jordan sort of struck that chord, and a lot of young men began to say, I think I would rather live that life. Where do I start? Because they have a sense that this isn't something they can do on their own. Their will, their desire, their intention is insufficient to actually give them a future of pursuing this vision. And that, so at our last meetup, actually, one of our members announced that he was engaged. He was engaged to his girlfriend. And he said, this meetup, being with you all has been an important part of taking that step. And I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now,
what did for you, what did it feel like? What was it like being you, hearing him say that? Like having sourcing, being a part of, being influenced, that being in a space such that you got to hear that and you had something to do with at least him getting that. What was that like? What was that like for you?
It's always, well, as a pastor, because in a sense what you are is the custodian of a tradition and a community. It's always both gratifying because it says that I haven't labored in vain. It's also terrifying because full well that, as a minister, often you do then sometimes go off and marry, perform the ceremony for these people. And then maybe a few years later, you'll be sitting with one or both of them when they get to the point of, this person that they've pledged undying love for, they're probably the most likely person they would, commit murder on. I mean, marriage is that way. The passions are up, and very few people kill people they are indifferent towards. And so it's gratifying, but it's tempered and sobered by a lot of experience.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that basically you heard it from inside on some level to being wedded to that person for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
So like being a minister, is it fair to say being a minister in some way is being married to whoever walks into your church?
Yeah.
Therefore, when you support, make possible, like guide, open up, say, has the implications of a lot of of that, something that you're already committed to being there for,
Yeah.
and to witnessing.
Yeah. And
Wow.
then sharing in the responsibility of where these things go.
Yeah.
Because, Pastor, you said if I would marry, it would be a good thing. And my marriage hasn't been a good thing. Okay.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
it,
How do you metabolize that? Like, what's the ride like? What's the ride like when you have heard that, or when you've heard something like that, or at least felt like that was the case? Like, what's that like for you?
well, anybody there, I have a mostly older congregation, so I don't do that many weddings, but people are sometimes in shock at the weddings I do, because a lot of ministers,
Mhm.
want to go out and laud the, the joys that will come. And well, usually when the joys come, people don't need any, the joy is its own reward.
Right.
I usually
Right.
remind them that vows are for doing what you should do but desperately don't want to do. And whereas when the people are looking their best, when
Mm.
they're in the midst of infatuation or the first bloom of love,
Mm.
those things are very easy. The reason you are surrounded by family and friends, hopefully, is that when
Mm.
you go to your friends and say, I can't stand him, he's an asshole,
Mm.
and I've been working on him for 10 years and he's never going to change.
Yeah.
The community comes around and, yeah, he is an asshole and he may not change, but you know, you've got a few little riders on that project that you
Right.
started, and
Yeah.
we're going to encourage you along the way. I mean, that's the terror of binding yourself to another person,
Yeah.
is the uncertainty of the future. You take a degree of certainty and you mix it with all the natural uncertainty that is there.
Yeah.
And so then as a pastor, you spend a lot of time sympathizing, listening, encouraging.
Yeah.
As counselors know too, you try to very seldom give direct advice, partly because it's pointless. Um,
Yeah.
but what you tend to try to do is help them see better and process.
Mm.
And because
Mm.
what
Mm.
anything that they're going to see, they're going to have to see themselves. And so as a conversation partner, you're sort of a midwife,
Yeah.
and you take what they have and you might twist it, and but that's the goal. but
Right.
but as a pastor, you're complicit in the tradition that you're stewarding, usually for better and for worse. And you bear that when you embrace a tradition.
That bearing, like that bearing. Because I was just thinking about, like, wow, it sounds like the role of a minister. It's really quite intense as you're describing to it. I'm like kind of crawling inside of it and just kind of getting it. It on one level, you're basically saying, all right, if you walk in to this church, like I by is it fair to say by being a minister, I is it, I don't know if the word sacrifice, but like I sacrifice my preference, right? And I'm already in a certain sense wedded, right, to the person walking in. And that weddedness is what I have an unconditional commitment to that. But then what I heard you say is you don't even get to argue with them or tell them what to do.
Oh, you can tell them what to do.
Yeah,
It's
totally,
pointless.
totally. Well, yes, totally.
And
There's
you learn that.
Yeah, yeah. But there's like that your sense of what you get to do is listen and midwife, right?
Yeah.
And yet, but it's interesting to think about, like most midwives, they come and, the baby comes and then they, like, I think about midwifing as they become pregnant with the baby the second time, right? And then but they get to hand the baby back off, stay there for a little bit, and then go home. You're like, all right, I don't know what I'm gonna give birth to, but and then I'm with them.
Yeah.
I'm with them.
Yeah. Well, you're midwife of, before I, started any of this.
Yeah.
In a secular, fairly materialist culture, I just read an article. Oh, there's Andrew Root he's just been writing some books about pastoring in, he doesn't know any of the discussions we're having in our little corner. It would basically be pastoring in a postmodern meeting crisis. That's what he's talking about, because in many ways with Galileo, the status and stock that clergy have had in the public sphere and in individuals' lives have been falling, pretty steadily all along.
Yeah.
I remember there was one situation in which there was an individual in this church that had been an alcoholic. He was raised in the church, and so was going to be in the church until the day he died. Not a particularly moral man, not a particularly good man, had a real problem with alcohol, but deeply, because of how he was raised and when and where he was raised, deeply committed to the church. And I remember things in his marriage had gotten to a point where there just needed to be an intervention. And so, I went to his house. His wife was doing her codependent things. I sent her to her room and I told him, I said, if you don't get yourself to a 12-step program, I'm going to put you under discipline. And that was enough. And I can count times like that on one hand in ministry, that the amount of authority remains in the institution in our time and place. What happens mostly is that when people hear what they don't want to hear, they simply leave, which means that churches had been sort of a larger communal marriage in which there was a commitment to the community. And the kinds of goods that you've recognized in marriage were similarly afforded, just like with marriage, not without downsides, not without abuse, not without all those things that happen amongst human beings.
Yeah.
But those privileges and outcomes were afforded by the broader community. And the pastor and the clergy class was in many ways stewards of that. And those days are gone in many respects. Yeah. And there's less abuse of some of the kinds of abuse that we saw pastors do. Right. But there's other losses which are not quite so easy to recognize.
Right. And I think some of the losses, is a little bit of what we touched on, right? Just these changes that we're talking about. Because I know a big part of even the sense of I'm going to meet somebody in my life and we're going to get married, because they all were, like, on some level, that's all like been intimately involved with Christianity and the church. I really appreciated the one of the things that you said, and unfortunately, like you, I don't have time to watch all your videos, but I try to watch as many as I can. And there was one that you really like put this metaphor. It's like the hand. I think you were referring to the atheist argument, right? Is like the hand does everything that a hand does, but doesn't acknowledge its connection to the arm. I was like, that's really a great way of putting it.
I'm curious with your circling, because
yeah,
I mean, there's no tradition around that. And so I would imagine people drop in, they have a great time, they say, oh, Guy, this was transformative, this was really cool, and whoop, they're gone.
Yeah, that happens for sure. I mean, my desire now, here's the thing is, I think that with the circling method, what it really does is it, on some level, it's about, it's very much about like, okay, let's draw an outline of the things that make something like deep intimacy and like profound conversations and connections happen. Like, what are the constraints on some level? And so we're going to get together and we're just going to sit inside of those constraints and notice when we're not, and then come back and then just tolerate that. The thing I really don't want is I don't want people to, I want them to use that in their lives, right? I don't think I want to promote, I don't think personally, I'm not inspired by, having intimacy without friendships, like, which is possible to actually have, right? So it's like, for me, I've always really, it's been like, no, it's just like when you do yoga, right? Like, you're not doing yoga most of the time to get good at yoga. If you get good at yoga, when you're walking around the world not thinking about yoga, your baseline is just more open. You have a better relationship with gravity, right? And that's the way that I really see circling, is it can be really transformative, right? And it has huge impacts on relationships. And I want them to like take this and go and have relationships. And I do think it is responding. And this is the Circling Institute. I see us responding in a way that's happened in some ways on its own, because it's been as much listening to what's going on that it's circling, and the world have informed each other and mutually shaped each other. And I think it is addressing, well, if you just look at it, I think this is the first time in history where all you pretty much need is an internet connection, right? And a room. And you can connect with 1 billion people. You could start a business. You can become a millionaire. You can start a company, right? You can claim to have 10,000 friends. You have your everything delivered to you, right? Without ever having to talk to another person. Now, if you think about it, that has not been that long that we've had the option to exchange information. Before, you always had to do this awkward thing that's scary as hell, right? Called facing another human being in the big vat of everything they are, and the big vat of everything you are, and tolerate the coordination and the possibilities. There's nothing about that that's comfortable, right? Like, think about how long it takes for you to become comfortable with somebody where you can just sit there and not have to talk or do anything. Those are really special relationships, right? That take time. Like, learning how to live with, 9 million strangers is so unusual for us, right? Because if you think about it, like, if you go before civilization, I was thinking about this the other day. Well, it's like, what must have it been like to where like you have 100 people that you're hanging out with, hunter and gathering, and that everybody that you know, you've known your whole life. And everyone that they know, they've known their whole life. There's everyone there. You've gone through all of this stuff, and that's been the whole history. That's going to be the whole future. And I imagine, what would be the experience of somebody not in your clan? Like, it's like, I would imagine it was just absolutely terrifying, threatening, just incredible. Now, like, we all live together, yet we have the same nervous system. So how have we dealt with that? Well, I think we've dealt with it through social norms, like etiquette and all these micro movements that no one knows how they know, right?
Right.
Like, is handshakes and in social organization. And if you think about it basically, all of that on some level is connected to being scared shitless of another human being.
Yeah.
That if they're not in your tribe, you want to kill them or run, right? Utter panic.
Yeah.
To being able to be in a place where we can walk down the street and we can say hi, right? That's intense. Like, that's really, really intense. I think something worthy of deep respect. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, go ahead.
Well, my wife is a Waldorf teacher.
Mm.
And so they start at first grade and they go up to eighth grade. And this year she's gone from eighth grade back down to first grade. And, she has the grieving of losing the eighth graders because they very much were her kids for 8 years. Wow. And then you don't realize what a group of first graders do and don't know, can and can't do.
Yeah.
And you realize exactly what you said, that, in a sense, just like we can imagine all you need is a room and electricity and a computer and an internet connection, the world beyond that, and that's simply how we are. And not, 150 years, not very long ago in the Americas, there were most people living, in these tiny little groups, degrees of network, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It's truly amazing. It's truly amazing we're doing as well as we're doing.
Yeah.
It's just terrifying to say.
Stunning. When you think about it, it's stunning.
Yeah.
It's stunning. Like, that we can find a way to, like, I can look at somebody and we can make eye contact and that could go well, right? And that being said, right, there's also this other way where we're designed to be around familiar people and to be in contact and like this, like, it's really strange. If you think about how important touch is. And I think it's important in primary because touch is also a communication, right?
Yep.
And it's in what it is it's almost like a pure confirming communication, right? This notion of, like, when I directly address you, like, even if I don't agree with you, I am in my address, I'm claiming your existence and acknowledging it, right? Touch is really like that, right? When I've gone, but now what's interesting is when I've really gotten a sense of this when I've gone and been hired by a family, where sometimes what I'll do is I'll go into a family that's struggling, and the way I'll work sometimes is I'll go and basically move in with them for a couple of weeks. And then and I seem to have a proclivity with losing the guest in the house feel pretty quickly, which you need to do so they get to do their thing and they're not performing or anything.
Yeah.
And just work with the family as it families. So I've learned so much from that.
I can imagine.
Yeah. But there was there was one family that was just so isolated from each other, right? This notion of having your own room as a value, right? And actually as a status symbol, right? Is so strange when you really think about it from this level, right? And so in this particular family, everyone was so isolated from each other in an extreme way. I could never catch them in. So the dynamic was played out in their distance, right? Where with some of the other families, they were more on top of each other, and like we do a lot of work in the car,
Yeah.
right, and work out these things. And
Yeah.
so then what we had to do is I basically had to work out with his dad. Like I was like, okay, let's unplug the back of the house and say that the power went down and PG&E had to come, which forced everybody out of their rooms into the living room, which of course forced the conversation that everyone was like not having. That was really like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But engaging in those, and that actually ended up like really transforming the family. It brought a lot of things up, and it wasn't, it didn't lead to a fix, but it actually led to things actually completing that were bad. It got worse, but having to deal with it, right? And I just, my sense is that we live in a time where the having to deal with everything that it takes, that traditionally is how we form an identity, is in those interactions and being an other for others, right? And all of the micro and the macro sense of that, which is so integral, almost synonymous with becoming an agent in an arena. We have more and more options to not have to do that. And I was talking to somebody who had taken our course a couple weekends ago, and they have a couple kids, and they were just, she was beside herself talking about her kids. She's like, yeah, the FedEx person rang the doorbell, and the kids were terrified just to answer the door. Right? And here's the thing: it's the terror, right? Isn't the issue? It's that it's because it's always been terrifying, right? But what's the issue is we have more and more ways of not having to face the terror because it's not necessary. And I think that division has happened so quickly on such a short amount of time that we have no idea how that's actually affecting us, right? And how it's changing our self-understanding, our sense of ontology, like what is or isn't important, our sense of identity. When I feel into kids, like teenagers, there's a level which when I feel into them, I'm like, whatever it is that when you kind of like, whatever it is that tells you are you, whatever you touch it on that has you go, oh, this is me when I wake up in the morning. It's a very different thing that they're touching. Then I don't know exactly what it is. It seems a lot more distributed. It seems a lot more lateral. And what they call real is very different. Like, and I'm just, this is why I really appreciate Heidegger when he's talking about the age of technology as not being about technological advices, but what it's expressing is a very, 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 very different and deep understanding of being that has a particular characteristic that it's an understanding that in its understanding hides its totalizing power, right? And that is kind of you notice that with technology is these epic breakthroughs happen that are normalized within 2 days and no one notices them. And then everyone lives inside of them, and then they're shaped by the thing that they're living inside of. And then they don't really even track any of it. So there's, the one of the things I've appreciated about your videos is I've always felt with you, right? This, or recognized, I think, a particular tonos, right? About basically being, for us in our view of where we are in history, we're like an ant on top of an elephant. And as an ant, we can only like see this much in front of us. That like, is it contrasted to a lot of what I'm hearing about, which kind of, I think, has this presupposition that we can actually just change history, or we can just change. We can develop a strategy and have a different ontological understanding. In fact, we can go to the grocery store and like, take your pick. Would you like to do? Which at some level seems to be, I've always been like, wait a minute, I don't even know what the hell I am, right? There's a certain, I think, an awareness that feels implicit and explicit in you that like honors the fact that like there's so much going on that we can't see. In fact, what it is to be human is to not be transparent to ourselves, right? Like, and that kind of sense of respect for there's a greater movement going on, right? That like, it's not the kind of thing that can be we can get clear about, right? And then act on. There's something about that I've really appreciated that about you, is that kind of an understand, like it just seems like a wisdom of a particular way of standing in all of this that I feel I've just always interpreted that in what you were saying, or felt that from you, and appreciated it a lot.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I am regularly astounded at how adaptable human beings are. I mean, it is, when I compare us to my dog or my cat, or, this whole idea of, I mean, you're describing a home in which people are, they're disconnected because they're living in their little boxes and they're living on their little screens. And you would not have been invited into that home unless and until some member somewhere in their social system said something is seriously wrong, to the degree that they let a total stranger move into their house. That itself is an astounding thing.
Yeah.
And to think about the fact that, I was talking to my adult Sunday school class last week and saying, a Roman bath didn't have all these little square cubicles where people would have privacy.
Yeah.
A Roman toilet didn't have, little one-seaters.
Yeah.
And in the ancient world, people, bathed together. They relieved themselves together. When they were, fornicating, or in the marriage bed, it was, slaves and children. And I mean, the privacy of our present world would simply be unknowable. Yet, this is part of the reason I've really appreciated the image that Brett Weinstein has, in that, yes, we have these genetics and that level to us, but this other level is, you cannot have a human being without having this other level. And that the diversity, how deep that diversity goes when you see it is simply breathtaking.
Right.
Right. And so to me, well, how would you represent such a thing? Well, it gets represented in a sense in humanism, which comes from Christianity. And, I don't know about other traditions, but that we are made in the image of God. We are these godlike beings that at the same time are so frail and so ridiculous and so, stupidly capable of utter folly. And, that's how we are. I've so appreciated, John's emphasis on wisdom institutions, because, we don't even know what wisdom is. And it takes so long to learn. And, it's a life as we live it today is both the most astoundingly, at least for many of us who live in the developed world and places like California, how unbelievable our fortune to live in such a time and place, to live as we do. I mean, it's just it's just an outsized miracle of which, we can take so little credit ourselves for it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything else. And
Right.
so,
Yeah, it's like wisdom seems to be, the more that you have it, the more you realize you aren't. Like, it's
yes,
one of those things where it's not a human possession,
no, no.
right? And that's what's a little bit scary about this kind of, I don't know, this techno and framing, optimizing sensibility, uh, is that it's really about like kind of extracting resources, or something that in like the least amount of time it takes, the more it collapses distances, we just implicitly value it, right? It's for me too. I'm like, I'm of that, you're of that, like
Yeah, here
it's
we are.
hard to even comprehend it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
This is kind of interesting. So these things with conversations, there's something different about it, I think, that captures my imagination. But I think one of the things that inside of that kind of technological frame that it doesn't seem to acknowledge as valid is what it is, I think, where much of wisdom comes from, which has this experience of like actually going through a period of time and being a fool, right? And having the consequences of foolishness, and then learning about reality and realize like, oh, this struggle to realize a potential, that at the end you realize that what you were after wasn't what you thought it was. And like all those things that are all about not collapsing distances, but actually in some ways paradoxically having distance become the thing that shapes your character, right? And even the notion, apparently, like what I've been hearing lately, that like the notion of character doesn't make sense for the current generation. Like they just don't have the notion of it. Like this idea of like that you go through something, right? And that you struggle with something, and then out of that struggle is how you're shaped, and that develops over time, which of course links very much with wisdom and in that whole conversation. That they don't live in a reality where that just doesn't occur for them as an ideal or as an option or as attractive. um and I've seen that, even in the change in watching my son's education. I remember in school, homework and your grades and things, it was a struggle and you did it. But it seems like the current educational system it's all about these kind of tests that they take,
Hmm.
that they can like, it's more, if as long as they pass these tests, which are usually measure something that's like based on intelligence, basically, like not necessarily what you've worked for, right? If they pass all these tests and they ace all these tests, that's what matters, and the actual schoolwork and their grades don't matter. That's all happened in a very short amount of time. That's a very radical shift. So even there, it's kind of like you think about the view of the education system, of how is it, in order to have it show up that way, what do you see people as?
Yeah,
Well, you
yeah,
see them as resources
yeah,
to optimize. Like
yeah,
if you have a talent in math or a high IQ,
yeah.
like like make sure you don't die. Let's get you in the right thing and make sure you take advantage. There's all this anxiety and this fragileness around it. Because I think in some ways it's almost like we've lost a whole nother dimension. Um, and again, I think you can probably hear in my voice that I'm scared about that stuff. I think but it's also really fascinating and interesting.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I have no idea if this is just a part of an evolution up that I can't even grasp or understand. But I'm just really present to the uncanniness and the those things that we used to call home are no longer intelligible to be there, right? In these deep ways that I think the strangest thing is, for me anyways, that's that I've been noticing is is that no one's walking around, like very few people are walking around going, isn't this weird? Right. So I feel on some level, I think that's one of the ways I'm personally responding to it is like really there's something innately important for me anyways, just by watching my behavior
Yeah.
is like is just to keep revealing and seeing what is most concealed, which is how weird everything is,
Yeah.
right? On some level.
I wonder if there wasn't more, that you mentioned earlier. I mean, plenty of studies about this, and church studies. People don't realize how much churches have been studied and study themselves, and
Right.
the idea that you can really maintain a face-to-face relationship at varying degrees with about 200 people. That's
Right.
it's a function of time and space, emotional energy, all that. People have different bandwidths within that, so on and so forth. We do live in a time and space when there has been such radical change in many ways. Technology has disrupted institutions, patterns of being. The prevalent ought to improve that lives. So we're trying to make schools better. We're trying to make housing better. We're trying to make life better, all with an amazingly weak grasp on what on earth we mean and know as better. And so we try things, and then after a certain point, a number of people say, "Was that better?"
Right.
"Oh, I don't know. Kinda." "How
Yeah.
was it worse? How was it better?" And round and round and on and on.
Right.
It would be interesting to get together with other parents. But again, part of it is, I mean, you and I both live in urban areas in California, astounding diversity of many, many kinds.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
it's in many ways, the world for many people just seems so, it's just simply too big.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
And so something as important to you as the education of your child,
Hmm.
well, you have this sort of trust that, well, I'll just let it go unless and until I see something that that triggers me, and then I'll act. And
Yeah.
because and how many things in our life aren't like that?
Yeah.
Because we're busy down here. We've
Yeah.
got a hierarchy. Here's the marriage.
Yeah.
Here's the parenthood.
Yeah.
Here's the
Yeah.
neighborliness. Here's the relationships at work. Here's the relationships in the third space, and on and on and on. And kids got to go to school. Keep the lights on. Keep food coming in. All kinds of other things. Let's have it be healthy food. What's happening in the formation of the child? I mean, just and again and it's not hard to see, because you can visit places of slower speeds in the country and in the world where you find these people have always lived together.
Yeah.
Family units are intact. Everyone knows each other.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of fly in there if you have significant enough relationships, and you can say, okay, well, boy, there's some real treasures there. There's also some real bindings there.
Yeah.
Some of those bindings don't impinge upon me, but also there's some poverties, and I lack some of those treasures. So.
Right. Totally. As I think about this, like on some level, I hear, one of the few things Heidegger says of course, he talks about the world of philosophy as not, you lose philosophy if you demand results from it, right? It's like it's something else if you're doing that with philosophy. So he's always been pretty at least in my mind or how I read them, you can read them especially Heineken. Jesus, I don't know if he thinks he says anything, right? But what he doesn't say can be really, really impactful, at least for me. But one of the things he said about like how to respond, right, to the technological age, and essentially, I think what he meant is like an age in which we've lost any sense of home, right? That's uncanny. On one level, there's uncanny, which means weird, but then there's uncanny, which means like the lack of homeness, right? Which makes everything weird, right? So this kind of like sense of deep familiarity that's, as you're talking about, like as it's linked to less and less, our home, just becomes someplace in the suburbs where we don't know our neighbor, right? But what he said is like in the danger is the saving power.
Hmm.
And what I take that to mean, and I don't know if I understand it fully, but in some ways, I think what I'm watching in the conversations about the meaning crisis, I think is actually, and I think John would agree, is very, in fact, me, John, and I think one of the most, in my view, the most Heidegger professor, right? Who really is the real deal. We're gonna have a three-way and talk about this specifically. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so present to me is we just scheduled it. I'm really excited about that. But in many ways, I think the meaning crisis is very, very much addressing what he means by the age of technology and that sense of history and the numbness and the nihilism that comes around it. But what I think he meant was that on one level, what he meant is a little bit like what we were talking about. We don't produce history. I don't think we produce history, right? Like I don't, it's not an object of my production. I'm of time. I'm temporal through and through before I have anything to say about it, right? So to piss in the wind of history doesn't make any sense, right? But it's in our response to it. And I think he would say something about like, well, one is to really see it, like really see it. And in a certain sense, respond to it in a way that where you can possibly, through the gift of the gods, right, could develop it beyond itself, right? That there's a deep intelligibility in here, right? In that it's the movement of the understanding of being, right? Is something to have faith in, is what I hear. However, how do we have faith, right? What is it to be in faith and to respond to it in such a way that in my response, I invite on some way, maybe even beyond a point that I can see in my own lifetime, but in some way that develops the understanding beyond itself. Right? I don't know what the answer is. Like when I ask myself how, I get kind of a little bit blank. However, it does seem to be one of the things about the circling method and what we teach and train is like, it's like I look at that, I'm like, oh yeah, there is a sense of where what we're talking about is like, what would happen if we just kind of came home together right here? Like if somebody's going through something, like how do we respond and how we hear that we're actually being with what is, without fixing it, without judging it, but actually just like, okay, if you're suffering, like let's just be with it, right? Like I'll suffer with you, right? And this is what it's like. And there is a sense in which it seems like that there's something still available in the I thou encounter that seems still available to me. And I sense it too in you and your sense of compassion and what you walk with. I would imagine in ways that are so implicit to you, you don't even notice it, but it really does stand out. And I just want to let you know, I really have appreciated your continuous compassion and like the courage the courage to completely explore in all these conversations that I think would look threatening to explore, I think, to many, but it seems like you keep turning towards it and are open to it.
Well, again, thank you. That's very kind. I mean, that word home, and what else you said, we don't produce history. I think in some ways that, I mean, both those concepts swing back into marriage where we started this conversation, because in a sense, what we do when we marry is we express an aspirational agency towards creating home. And that is obviously the context in which children come into this world. You very much want your child to have a sense of home. And again, we don't produce history, but there's an interesting relationship between that and home. Tolkien, obviously, in his, in The Hobbit, when, Bilbo, Tolkien on one hand very much has the Hobbit hole as home, and yet Bilbo must leave home, there and back again.
Yes.
And one of the things, so, I think a lot about, we obviously have this longing for home. This is deeply built into a lot of church language. We have home is identified with what comes after death often. The technology as destroy, I mean, that family that invited you to live with them in order to address a malady they couldn't name, they were looking for home. And they had a sense that you could help them. And even look at these spatial metaphors we're using, had a sense that you could help them find home, even though they're clearly living in their house. And if asked to sit down and describe just what home is, well, all of us would be hard pressed. We might be able to offer up some adjectives that are evocative. We might be able to offer some word pictures that trigger in us memories and visions of home. But one of the things that C.S. Lewis talks about in the beginning of Mere Christianity, with his argument from Desire, is that we all have a longing and a sense for this really, and even home. I mean, again, the being, we have a sense for being, because it's it's the whole thing. It's in Christian terms, the language is consummation, which is obviously connected to a couple consummating a marriage. And in the book of Revelation, it's the consummation of Christ and the bride. It's the consummation of heaven and earth. It's the consummation, and there's, we don't, Lewis points out, we don't get there here and now. We taste it, and Lewis notes that the tasting of it is spread liberally, in that it's some of the best meals I ever had were in some of the poorest, most remote communities you could imagine, where usually women would sit by a charcoal fire and work on a meal of some fish and some rice and a few seasonings they could get together, and that meal would be cooked over the 3 or 4 hours we had in the church service. and then you come out and, you know, and you think, wow. So if these people who have so little, at least they get to share in this joy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so that, and this is part of the reason that I, you know, will, you'll try, you can try to, you know, I'm not giving up my hope of heaven. I'm not giving up my hope of home, because,
Yeah.
you know, even just the, even the hoping for it
Yeah.
is a participation
Yeah.
in home, and often the closest I can get in this space and time where all of us feel it's, all of us miss it.
Just really,
So
I'm really appreciating kind of like, as you're I feel like I just took a walk with you, right? So as the process of understanding what you were just saying, I felt like on some level I had to actually recognize what you were saying in a certain sense. I just felt really, I appreciated the way that you just expressed that. And I noticed that what comes up for me when you say that is like, you use the word yearn for home. Right? Yearning is, to me, seems to always kind of connotate that, and like a yearning in some sense is, it usually kind of evokes something that you can't get, like an object you can't possess. You yearn for God, or you yearn for something transcendent. Therefore, on some level, the yearning itself is its announcement, right? It's like it. So, in other words, it's like this very. I felt like on one level, this it's a very intimate thing to yearn for something, and it announced. I think it probably displays a little bit of the nature of what home is, because there's something in Rilke, in the first Dueno eulogies. The first one where he's talking about, like, he said something like this. He's like, even in the warm animal's gaze, right? It knows we are not at home in our interpreted world. And I think that what I just heard in that, like that went through my mind. What I heard in that is like, actually, so much of homeness for us, right, is so wedded to that home needs to be something that we're constantly yearning for. But in the yearning means that there's something ungettable, yet the thing we're yearning for is inherently ungettable. So it's kind of like there is that quality. I know in a conversation with my friend Mark the other day, we were talking about, like, he's like, I think we've been in a meaning crisis from day one. We've always been in a meaning crisis. And I appreciated what he was saying. It's like, oh yeah, like maybe and I think what I heard in that is a little bit of what you're I think, but what you're saying too, it has me, like the way that you're having it talk to me, I'm recognizing as a lot more at my own center of this sense of that to what it is to be human is to be the being that is at question, right? To be alive is to be in trouble on some level already, right? Like on some level, it's not, we're not given home like an object, where I think I can imagine in an animal's kind of way of being, that they're not yearning for home, right? On some level, they're satiated. Their instincts are all there. There's it's a very, very different sense for us because we can't ever attain it, right? It's what we yearn for, but the yearning for and responding sensitively to that, right, seems to be the enactment of home. But implicit is a homelessness. So it's interesting when I think, if I take that and I kind of take up the way that you talked about, the best meals that you ever had, Like I wanted to sink into that because I've heard that thing before, and but I heard it newly somehow. What is it? What do you think is going on about that? That on some level, these people that are poor have less security, yet you can go in and have a meal with them and feel more at home than right when you're in the city or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What is that? Like I'm just curious, what is it's going on there? What's the difference that makes that difference, you think?
It's hard. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
I have this with the homeless. Ironically,
Mm.
I have ongoing relationships with a number of people who are homeless, and I will often think about them when I am on a cold night. It doesn't get that cold in Sacramento, only into the 30s. A cold night, and I am in bed, and I am thinking about them, and I don't know. I think there was just always something in the meals shared with the Haitians, which, because I, at least comparatively so, was so much wealthier than they were, that my father, when my father came down to the DR a few times, and he loved going out to the churches with me, and so of course there's, oh, here's your father, and so you have to heap the praises on him. I'm just a young kid, and they set in front of us this big plate of rice, and my father's digging in to eat the whole. I said, Dad, don't eat the whole thing. It was like, why? I said, because what you leave, others will eat. And so, eat enough to demonstrate your gratitude and your appreciation for the fact that these people who struggle to feed their children have just placed an enormous heaping plate of food in front of you.
Yeah.
And and everything that goes into that.
Yeah.
And boy. Another thing C.S. Lewis writes about that has impressed me deeply. He has this essay, which you can find online, about equality, and he writes about the specific pleasure of the inferior, which is something that is very un-American, because we don't like to imagine there is an inferior, and if there is an inferior, it must be banished somehow, as if we can do that. But the specific pleasure of an inferior, which is, the dog feeling the gratification of satisfying its master.
Yeah.
And we know this. We know this in lovemaking. And lovemaking is a playful exchange of agency, of giving and receiving, of agency and reciprocation, and so I think a deep part of home is the particular satisfaction of the inferior, that we are recipients of costly grace, but that grace has been given to us, though it has been costly. It is also well given. It's the superior's good pleasure to do that for the inferior. And we experience this with our pets, we experience this with our children, we experience this in marriage, and it's experiencing the fullness of life as being able to participate and indwell in the various positions within relationality. And home is, again, I think it gets back to the marriage conversation. In that marriage, there is a participation in home like there can't be without the audacious promises given that none of us can really live up to, and the other person knowing it.
Wow, that's interesting. Wow, it's a couple of things. I have so much going on with you right now. Like in this conversation, so many things are present. I have like tears coming up to my eyes. My heart feels super open. Like there's just so many things that just moved me in what you just said. Like, first of all, I felt really impacted, like by when you talked about, the homeless. Sometimes when it gets cold out, I think of them. I think what I feel struck by and moved by is that they reside in you on some level.
Yeah.
Right? They're in your breadth of concern, right? Like just that way of being is just really moved me, like what you just demonstrated there. Like just by being you and the way that you live your life, I could feel where that comes from. And I could feel, what comes up to me is actually something that you said to me in our first talk, which by the way, I loved our first, like when we talked, right? Loving this one too. But one of the things that you said to me that I learned a little bit more about my own history in our conversations. And through some of the things that you recognized, you put it in a way that like had it be so much more present to me. And one of the things that you said is, you really got my grandparents, right? Who in some ways kind of saw me and saw my parents kind of like in the instability and stuff. And you said this one thing, and I've thought about this over and over and over again. They poured their life into this young man. Like poured it into, it's like, I was like, that's exactly what they did. Like they really did. And you're right. There was a sense of, it wouldn't have been what it is if there was a guarantee that was going to work out. Like on some level, I think that pouring was in the presence of a recognition of unable to fulfill in any controlled way, whether or not this pouring of my life. And, it's the last part of their life, right? It's like in many ways, they could probably be like, I've already done this, but they thought of me when it was cold, right? They held me in that way and so as you're talking about that, there's you're right. There's an inadequacy or what was it that you said in deficiency? What was the thing that you said about what was inherent is the awareness of, is it lack? Was C.S. Lewis? I think
the specific pleasure of the inferior.
Yeah, the pleasure of the inferior. It's funny because, that sense of pouring your life into somebody, right? With every intention, if you can control that thing, you would. But like really realizing like I could just like pour my life for the last 10 years and I inherently know that like that I don't have control over the outcome of how that happens, but I can't not do it. And the spirit that evokes, that really like really open. I just feel really opened, like it touches my heart. Yeah.
Well, and I was.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's
I mean,
beautiful to be seen.
Yeah.
I was. So one of the homeless guys turned 60, and it was his birthday, and so I facilitated the phone call between him and his parents, who are in their 90s. And just in that phone call, so this particular individual has a lot of, he's always homeless for a reason. But, and I just in that moment, seeing the relationships
Mm.
of these parents who,
Mm.
the father especially, I think, continues to reach out and pour himself into his 60-year-old son as best he can, who this 60-year-old son will likely, in my estimation, he'll his mental illness will not be fixed.
Yeah.
His addictions will likely not be fixed.
Yeah.
He is going to walk around on the streets for another 5 or 10 years, and something's going to take him out. It could be a car, it could be a bug, it could be a crime, but that's going to happen. And
Mm.
there's why should we care about something like this image? Yet we do deeply, and we have, again, a yearning, a longing. We have a sense that that shalom, that life, the way it should be, has been deeply ruptured, and we have a yearning that it be healed and restored.
Mm.
And we have a yearning that there could be home, and home includes, the father and the mother embracing the son. Now, this 60-year-old individual is also divorced because his marriage couldn't take everything. Father of 4,
Right.
and who his children are, I've met one of his children.
Yeah.
They're young adults in their 20s, and you see this, and my heart longs for restoration. My heart longs for that they can find home. And, even on the little short phone call, when the 90-year-old parents and the 60-year-old son are trying to find each other in the conversation,
Yeah.
you just yearn and long. You see glimpses of participation of home. And yet you long and you yearn for its consummation. Yet we don't know what we have inklings of what that would look like, but we don't know how we could make it so. And so you sit and you watch, and you respect the holiness of the moment, and you live in hope for that consummation, for him, for his parents, for his children, and all along. And we all do that for ourselves too, because every marriage, there are moments in marriage of bliss.
Yeah.
But there are far more moments in marriage of longing, of longing for home, of longing for communion, of wishing that we could live up to the needs and desires of the other, and the other could live up to our needs and desires as well. And it's in that tension, I think, that we are pulled into the future, and it's institutions like marriage that actually form and shape that, institutions like parenthood that do this. And so, to bring it back to wisdom, wisdom is knowing how, what is a marriage? Marriage is, wisdom plus agency. And that, then you get an institution, and your
Wisdom.
children hopefully will learn from that.
Yeah. And this, oh my, as I'm thinking, right? Like, I think we talk about unconditional love, like we know what we're talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like what, and I'm really hearing I'm getting a radically different picture of what you're talking about. Because on some level, what I'm hearing is that, like, with the father who's been in whatever way that he can at 60, is pouring and it's almost certainly not going to work out, right? Yet he pours, right? He pours. And it's not like, because it's not only not what's interesting is when I think what I'm getting, let's see if I can bring words to it. It's like, I think if I walk with this, it's like what I'm getting is it's not only that he's doing it knowing it's not going to work out, but even if it did work out, that yearning would still be there.
Yeah.
It's true. It's radically unconditional.
Yeah.
Like, it's funny. I'm thinking now. I'm really thinking about, you know, I've always been so intrigued by the two fingers of Michelangelo.
Hmm.
Right. I think there's a profound reason why that captured us. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like my understanding is when I studied painting, like that scene is always before that was always very depicted where it's kind of like the human being was the meager one that was yearning for God, and like God was kind of had a distance or an indifference or a sternness to it. But all of a sudden, like, that painting is considered the culmination or the peak of humanism of the Renaissance, right? And no wonder it's like, because here Michelangelo's like no, God has tendons and guts, and it's like eternity actually yearns for finitude, right? Like that sense in the pit and they don't touch. And if they did touch, no one would even look at that painting. Right? It's that they don't touch, which is the thing that is so touching about it, right? This sense of, and I oftentimes have gotten that picture of like when I've been really, really like with people and like you really see their hearts. I just get this sense it's almost like in every human heart are those two fingers. And that experience, and just like the movie and the book that was written about Michelangelo, they call it the agony and the ecstasy. And there's like, this is like, whatever this is, right, seems to be an experience of absolute, like, could be torturous, but and the very same thing can be ecstatic. And I'm just present to that as you're talking, of that on some level we're talking about something so personal,
Yeah.
right? Yet something at the same time is so transpersonal, like, so, but almost like, it's really rich. I just I mostly just feel it in my heart. I'm trying to bring words to, but basically, Paul, you just opened my heart. Thank you.
Well, but that's beautiful. And I'd never, I've seen that picture how many times, but I've never thought of I mean, you're exactly right. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
That it wouldn't, if there was like this, everybody'd move on to the next thing.
Right.
But
right.
Now C.S. Lewis talked about that as Sengstock, where that's joy and longing, and it's this ache in our heart that is, that we can't get enough of. Nostalgia tries to get at that, but nostalgia sort of sells too cheap. And I think and for Lewis, it was that aching joy that drew him. That's what drew him. And I get that sense. We are pulled into the future by the future. We are pulled into the future by home.
Yeah. And what I'm really getting from this conversation in a very rich way is precisely our innate homelessness allows for the importance of home to be forever important to us, right? But yet never achieved in some kind of mechanistic, finalized way. It's funny, like I think about this picture, of course, I like being present to this, and then just looking at, housing complexes and suburbs and stuff like that. I'm like, oh yeah, this is it really has its show itself. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Paul. This has been really great. Unfortunately I have a client that I have to meet.
No, this is no, you're so generous, Guy, and yeah, no, I really appreciate you. I appreciate this conversation. I really, well, if you move to Alameda, I get to Alameda semi regularly.
Oh,
so
you do?
yeah, I've got a friend. There's a church in Alameda, so I
Yeah.
do get to Alameda. So
Yeah.
I'd really love to sit.
Send me an email. I'll send you my phone number too if you want to text me. Let's
Okay.
definitely get together.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you so much. Mwah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.